Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Maitri and I'm very passionate about tabletops and I am learning to be a better GM, a better player, and a better person. And I want to share with you some of the cool stuff that I've been learning. Today I want to talk to you about something that's been kind of percolating in the back of my brain for a little while. Running feminine horror for tables. Primarily men at the tables, but tables in general. It's fucking hard. Even with like really emotionally intelligent, like sensitive, kind, thoughtful players, like there's a fair bit of intentionality that's needed. And I think I finally understand what's challenging about it. So, I wanted to share. This is probably going to be a little bit longer than my standard videos, which are about 9 or 10 minutes. This might be closer to about 20 or 30 minutes because I feel like I have a fair bit I want to say about this, and I've been thinking about it for a little while now. Bef- Before I dive in, kind of want to set the stage a little. First of all, this video might make some people uncomfortable. I want to be clear, these are observations, not judgments. If something comes across as critical, that is not my intention. I'm just a human being, like, trying to figure things out and probably saying things wrong and just like being clumsy with my word choice. So please allow me a little bit of grace in that respect. Secondly, this is not a critique of my players or of my table. My players and the ones I'm talking about specifically in this video, they came to the table with generosity, with care, with a real desire to help me tell the story that I wanted to tell. Like, I felt supported every step of the way. I consider them exceptional players. And more than that, I consider them pretty amazing people. I'm even married to one of them. So yeah. So this video, like I said, it's a little longer than my average videos because I have been sitting on this for a little while. So it comes from experience. It comes from so many missteps and a little bit of some amount of reflection. Yeah, and to be super clear, also like another caveat is that this is not about gatekeeping. I'm not trying to keep people out. It's the opposite from my perspective. I feel like feminine horror, it can kind of feel niche, it can feel kind of gendered, maybe not as accessible. This is about inviting people in, not keeping people out. So let's dive in. People who've been here for a minute know that I like how I approach. So let's start with what. What is feminine horror? Some of you might already know, but for anyone who's not super familiar with the term, basically at its core, feminine horror is horror told either through the lens of through a feminine lens or deals with topics and themes surrounding womanhood. So it's not horror that like features women necessarily, but sort of grounded in the specific fears, the pressures, and the contradictions that can come with being raised as or perceived as or identifying with femininity or womanhood. And those are all constructs that are defined by society and by individuals. So it really comes down to a lot of personal experience. So just from that description, even you can probably tell like it's not about jump scares, it's about discomfort, about being simultaneously too much and not enough. It's about being failed by things that you trusted and you were told to trust them. It explores how identity, how agency, how your bodies are controlled, they're dismissed, they're punished, by systems, by relationships, by individuals, by culture even. Common themes in feminine horror stories are being reduced to a single role, so like your virgin mother or a hag, like a crone, being expected to nurture, to forgive, to stay silent, and being punished if or dismissed if you choose not to do any of those things. Fear of having too much or not enough desirability or losing desirability through aging. Powerlessness in systems that claim to protect you. The horror of being believed too late or not at all. So it's important to remember that feminine horror is not only for women, because like I said, this is not about gatekeeping, but the themes it explores can hit differently if you have lived in a body that is objectified, that is controlled, that is dismissed, that is punished for just existing in some spaces. That lived lens is really what kind of gives the genre its teeth. It's not just like, what if the monster was a woman? It's, what if the world made you the monster and then told you it was your fault? What if the world broke you and then called you dangerous for not smiling about it? What if every choice you made either pushed you closer to being feared and isolated or closer to being erased? What if the horror was seeing yourself as something monstrous and different than what you imagined, and you realize that everybody else already saw you that way? So those are kind of the themes of like discomfort and incongruity that feminine horror tries to explore. Some popular culture examples that people might know, there's Jennifer's Body, which is fundamentally about like teenage girl, killed by people she has no reason to distrust. And the overarching theme is about how society wants your sexuality, but will punish you if you give it up. Ginger Snaps is another movie where puberty, kind of going from girlhood to womanhood, is sort of treated as this almost like body horror kind of thing, and she transforms into something fairly unrecognizable where even her family has no control over what she is now, and they have no ability to manage her. Another one that people might know is The Babadook. Really, this one's about like a lot of stuff about postpartum and grief. Really, this has a lot of themes around like repressed grief and motherhood being sort of these unshakable monsters. There's the other one that's actually my personal favorite is Teeth, and I've kind of written out a description for this. A girl discovers a violent supernatural defense mechanism in her own body, and every time she uses it to protect herself, she's punished. It's a pretty visceral take about how, like, Female sexuality is considered dangerous if it doesn't serve men. Next one, a newer one that people might do is the substance. That's come out fairly recently, and really the theme is about how beauty is a currency, costs basically everything, and so, aging makes you invisible, but desirability makes you disposable. An older one that people might know also is Rosemary's Baby. This one has more straightforward themes around marital rape, forced birth, and frankly, a woman being gaslit by everyone around her. With tabletops, I think the most famous one probably is Bluebeard's Bride, where people kind of embody different aspects of a single woman's identity as she explores her new husband's home or workplace or whatever it is. Every room they enter, every situation they encounter, basically asks them, what are you willing to endure to live the kind of life you want? The next one is Thousand-Year-Old Vampire. This one is not like exclusively feminine horror, but I mean, it's a solo journaling game if people aren't familiar. But it really plays with themes of like memory and identity, and it can be seen from a feminine horror perspective and lens where it's about surviving by erasing yourself again and again and again until there's basically nothing left except a performance that society is okay with. Yes, you're an immortal, but only in forms that are allowed by society. So erasure of your personhood is really the primary way that you might be able to survive. The last tabletop I want to talk about is Sleepaway. This one's a horror game about camp counselors protecting children from the lindworm, monster that leaves no trace, only absence. Through a feminine horror lens, the lindworm becomes about sort of the embodiment of all the violence that kind of just goes, I'll figure it out, I'll handle it, and it's primarily unspoken. The fear then isn't about roaring monsters, not about jump scares like I said. It's about being thought of as unstable and being disbelieved, violated invisibly, and basically losing spaces that you thought you could trust. So when we say feminine horror, what we mean really is horror that centers the emotional and physical and social stories about being a woman, not just like the presence of a woman in like horrific stories. Feminine horror isn't even like always visually grotesque. Sometimes it's the horror of pregnancy. Sometimes it's the fear of being stuck in marriage with no way out. Walking home alone at night. It's about powerlessness, especially in systems that pretend to offer you safety, or that other people say should offer you, will offer you safety. You're expected to trust these systems, but at the same time, if you aren't careful, like, what are you, stupid? Why would you go out wearing that? Like, you're asking for trouble. And again, this is where the no gatekeeping comes in. Like, all this stuff does not mean that it's exclusively for women. The themes are just kind of about womanhood, and they're tied to a lot of lived experiences that maybe don't show up in traditional horror. I'm including a really great write-up that I found in doing research for this video. I'll put that in the description box. You should for sure check it out. Moving on to the game that did not land. I ran a feminine horror game a while back for a group of for a table that was all men, and as I said at the start of this video, these are not like broy, insensitive dudes. Like, these are thoughtful, emotionally in tune, genuinely excited players who showed up like deeply invested and with care and curiosity. But the tone just didn't land. Somewhere along the way, it slid out of feminine horror and just moved into basic survival horror. And I really like running horror as a GM, so like instantly went to like, what did I do wrong? The fear I wanted, which is, being stuck, being offered help that you can't really trust, just didn't click. They kind of all approached it like, okay, let's strategize, let's find a way out, let's beat the system, which is a totally valid way to play, but it wasn't the story I was trying to tell. They just didn't connect with that feeling of helplessness, of being unable to leave, being too scared to accept the only help available. They played the game I presented. I just didn't make the emotional core clear enough. That experience completely changed how I think about running genre-driven, emotionally layered games, especially ones so rooted in something as specific as feminine horror. So what can I do differently? Back then, I was still figuring out a lot of like who I was as a GM. I mean, I still am. I'll probably never stop. But I feel like I'm a lot further ahead now, and I'm a lot clearer on what matters to me and what makes a game feel like it's working. At the time, though, I had internalized this weird idea that if you were really good, you shouldn't need to have meta or above the table conversations. Tone, theme, consent, emotional texture, like that stuff will all just like magically land if you ran it right and if you were good enough. And so being direct felt like it felt like cheating, first of all, and also that I was just kind of doing it wrong. Honestly, I still see this mindset pop up in tabletops and like especially online, this weird like quiet stigma that like over prepping or naming themes up front is somehow like less cool. Like the real pros just kind of like wing it and the table just sort of picks up on the vibe without anyone ever having to say anything out loud. Spoiler alert! That's minimum 3 kinds of bullshit. So let's talk about the value of the meta conversation. Meta conversations are not stupid. First of all, like they're just kind of part of your GM craft, especially if you're aiming to run something as nuanced and as specific as something like this, or any kind of layered and nuanced stories for that matter. If that's not your style, that's fine. But like, if it is, if you're wanting to tell like emotionally complicated stories, then naming tone, naming themes, naming expectations upfront or as they rise is how you make space for players to help you tell the kind of story you want. You're not spoiling anything. You are giving your players tools to help you build it. feminine horror in particular often runs on like this tension that's like subtly uncomfortable and a lot of times culturally coded. Power dynamics, social expectation, the dread of being, disbelieved and dismissed. These are not things that every player will instinctively pick up on, especially if they have not lived that life. It's not a flaw. It just means that the game needs context. It's a fucking game. It needs context. You provide context for everything else. This is no different. The only thing that maybe makes it different is that the meta conversation is the context because it gives your players a roadmap and it tells them what emotional weight to give to a moment. It shows them that you trust them with with complex material. So no, taking the time to talk about themes, talk about tones, talk about characters does not make you less cool or capable. It makes you better. And it's how you get everyone on the same page. Without the context, the game risks sliding back into more traditional themes, into more generic or surface level choices that kind of miss the deeper point. These days, I really don't hesitate to spell things out for players. I'll specifically say your drive is to leave home and never return unless it's entirely on your terms. Everyone around you settled, got stuck, or gave in, and you are afraid of becoming just another version of that. Throughout the play of the game, we will explore whether you'll break free from that or the cost of choosing that. Whether the weight of comfort pulls you back to safety, but not freedom. By saying the words clearly and directly and framing it in a way that's emotionally grounded but not gender specific, it gives players something to hold on to, especially those who might not have lived some of the experiences the horror is drawing from. The hope is that it's going to make choices a little more complicated and help sort of steer the game away from like default survival horror, where the instinct is just to kind of escape at all costs. Because in this kind of horror, escape isn't freedom. It's just a return to something familiar and dreadful in its own quiet awfulness. You're not surviving the horror or escaping it anymore. You're deciding what kind of life you're willing to live with. Players can absolutely still choose to leave, but the point is, they understand that leaving isn't victory, it's just a different kind of loss. So, just to summarize, feminine horror is super vibe heavy and like thrives on tone and subtext because even the concept of safety is so nebulous. So even the stakes are not always clear, nor should they be, especially when you're running this kind of thing for people who have not experienced those specific tensions. You need to find a way to kind of bring them into the emotional headspace much more deliberately, and you're not weird for providing context because that's just a thing you do in games. Otherwise, like, it's super easy for the game to drift into more like familiar territory of like escape puzzles and monster fights and things with a more clear and more familiar kind of structure and payoff that you can probably do super well. So in addition to this stuff, one personal guideline that I've developed for myself, and this really speaks to like do what works for you as a GM and for your table. For me specifically, I will not run feminine horror games anymore unless there's at least one other woman at the table. Not because men can't manage it, but because I kind of feel like I think I need at least one other person there who just like gets it. And that will help me build a kind of emotional architecture I want to build and hold in place. It's just having someone who speaks the same dialect of fear and that shared understanding just kind of helps hold the tone and ultimately then the game. I hate to generalize, but for better or for worse, I feel like people raised as female tend to recognize certain tensions instinctively. I'm sure folks that have been raised male have their own versions of that. And for horror this layered, that recognition matters to someone, to me, and to the kinds of games I like, which is why I've decided I would like another one at the table. Because this isn't just about fear. It's about a very specific kind of fear rooted in like loss of control and vulnerability, the sort of quiet expectation, and that can hit differently depending on where you are coming from. So in games like this, range of perspectives really can help the story feel a little more grounded and have the space to try and say what it's trying to say. So to wrap up, I think this concept of a unspoken shared context has its limits. If you want to engage with certain kinds of horror, if you want to engage with certain kinds of storytelling, that's a little more nuanced, a little more emotionally complicated. We need a shared language. And sometimes that language has to be built deliberately. Or we have to decide we're telling a different kind of story, which is totally fine, to be clear. But like, for a theme like feminine horror, I do think it takes a certain amount of intentionality, a certain amount of care and clarity. I have tried to share what I think can help bridge the gap here. Hopefully it works. Anyway, if you like this video, consider subscribing. If you don't like notifications of this episode, I do a backlog of stuff. And I also have an audio-only podcast format and a written blog, like if that's better for like accessibility, tech, or apps, or anything at all. I'm also on a few APs, links to all of that in the description. Otherwise, thank you so much for hanging out. Come see me again soon. Bye.